Thanks everybody for coming in. A fantastic turnout for what I know is going to be a great pop-up event this afternoon over the next hour or so. First things first, if you could grab your version of this and turn it into the airplane version of itself for the next hour. Thank you. In fact, today's pop-up event, whose title is on the screen, dedicated to Lebbeus Woods. I think maybe the first thing to say about it is it's a kind of perfect example of what a few years ago we tried to create with an open week, sort of halfway through the term, where in fact teachers and students can deliberately step outside for a few hours, maybe even just 1 hour. The year-long work developing upstairs in the units and back in the studios in the school, and during that time come together for an event like this that brings together people from across the school around a topic or an interest or a theme that might give us a chance to not just see the current work of the school in different ways, but to see it in relation to different frames, you could say for a minute, other than the obvious ones of unit agendas, parts of the AA school, and the spaces that you all inhabit all year. And in fact, I think today's topic and interest is an inspired one that Ricardo and Nannette have been working on for some time, that will look at the work from 3 different parts of the school in relation to a renowned figure, a lifelong friend and fanatic of this school and a few other key experimental outposts, Lebbeus Woods, the late great Lebbeus Woods, who passed away 2 years ago, sadly, incredibly sadly for many of us that knew Lebbeus, at a time in his life when I think we all thought there were many, many more years, indeed decades of further visions of what the world might become that he could contribute to architecture, which he did in many ways over his long career. Lebbeus is a figure that, as I'm sure Ricardo and Nannette will introduce in a minute, is a frequent visitor of this place over the years. He told me once when I first met him after graduating from the A that Lebbeus first came here in the 1970s, although he was kind of vague on the exact decade or year, that he walked into this building and was in fact going through a profound transformation of his own career, which is in and of itself a startling one. Lebbeus, many people don't know, began life as a great modernist renderer in the city of Manhattan, and he was in effect a professional artist commissioned by renowned architects to make glossy renderings of late modernist icon buildings, which he did like few other people of his time. He made piles of money, he said, doing that. Loved making drawings and images, but at a kind of key point in his own life realized that in fact his talent was such that he didn't need to try and illustrate the known ideas of other architectural figures, which he was well compensated for, but in fact was a talent for him imagining worlds that hadn't yet been realized or received, that he could, in the closing 30 years of his life, focus his attention and energy on. He did that to spectacular effect, making the drawings that I think many of you people know here already very well. Lebbeus was last with us here at this lectern via a very large screen and a Skype connection that was fading in and out about 3 years ago, a little bit longer, two and a half years ago, very near the end of his life, and with all of the kind of energy and fervor that he brought to any architectural discussion or debate about the work of students or teachers or any other kind of figure in the architectural world. It was an incredibly moving moment and afternoon where he was quite happy to try and animate this office via a little 15-inch rectangular version of himself, which he did with convincing language and hand gestures. I had the great pleasure and honor of meeting him 25 years ago exactly as I graduated from the AA. I moved back to New York, and in an elevator in Manhattan, was introduced to him as we were going up to a party in one of Zaha's buildings in New York at the time. He was curious that I had just come back from London to New York, made a joke or two about the similarities between the two cities, and when another person joined us in the elevator, Lebbeus turned to this person and said, "I'd like you to meet Brett Glass," which I was utterly confounded by. And of course, what he was playing a game with was glass and steel, and his kind of capacity for a turn of language or words or thinking is, I think, one of his great gifts, and I would argue one of the things that explains why his images are of the incredible kind of depth and potency that they are. And with that as a kind of setup for the afternoon, I think I'll turn it over to Nannette and Ricardo. Say thank you again for the two of you for organizing the event. It's going to be a good one. Thank you all for coming in, and for our guests that are going to present the work of some of you in the audience and some of their other students and collaborators as part of the event. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett, and good afternoon to all of you as well. Thank you for coming. Just to add to Brett's introduction about this event today, this is the first of a series of events that we will be doing, the next one in the next term. And this has to do not all about Lebbeus Woods, but all about subjects or people who inspire and influence our work, not just our personal work in the office, but also and mainly here to discuss the work we do with the unit here at the AA Inter 3. There will be, or the whole series is called Scavengers and Other Creatures. This is also the title of the forthcoming publication. There will be an Inter 3 book coming out in spring. And yes, all the events will be alongside the publication coming out. So as it was said already, this event today is about remembering Lebbeus Woods and to celebrate his quite unique work. To remember is not only to recapitulate, but it's also to create, to make it your own, and to give new meanings while keeping the integrity and sharing core values. So the way how we set it up today is, I think you could talk endless about Lebbeus Woods' work, but we divided today into three themes, or three questions, as we say, that Lebbeus' work raise. But before we come to these three questions, I just want to give you a very, very short overview of his life. Lebbeus was born in 1940 in Lansing, Michigan, and he was educated at the Purdue University School of Engineering and the University of Illinois School of Architecture. Later, after studying architecture, he joined the firm of Kevin Roche, John Dinklew as Associates in 1964. He served there as a coordinator of design and construction for the Ford Foundation headquarters building in New York City until '67. In 1973, he won the P&A Award for Applied Research in Architecture. And then since '76 until the end of his life, he lived in New York City, where he was concentrating on architectural theory, experimental projects, and teaching.
So, as Nannette said, we divided this event in three key points in a way that we can maybe not just recapitulate the idea and the works of Lebbeus Woods, but start raising questions about how is his work aging, or how can we start interpreting and utilizing that work and his legacy as a departure point. From the few points that we collaborated with Lebbeus, he was always very keen on this utilization of ideas, and sometimes he even sort of correct, instead to use the word his strategy, he always said he preferred the word principle, because less to do with strategic military operations of organizations, and he was more keen on this potential fluid effect of one person utilizing and taking each other's work forward. So today we have three fantastic speakers from within the school doing a cross-section through the whole, or a big part of the academic faculty, which passes through intermediate in the unit, diploma, and the postgrad. We're going to be introducing them very soon. But we decided to do this event in a slightly different fashion. We asked the guests to speak about their work. So how their work not relate, but reacts to a few positions that could kickstart for rethinking some of the ideas, some of the many ideas that Lebbeus Woods has in his many projects. So we divided in 3 questions, and we asked the guests to speak about it in their own way, utilizing their own work, which in a way many of us and many of you that study here at this school might not know their work as a practice, as an office. You might know their work as great educators. So on that threshold, we start with the first question of cybernetics. The first question to pose today would be about the branching of our relationship to information. Lebbeus' work is sometimes understood as a pencil and paper operation only. Pencil and paper it is indeed. However, he articulates notions of communication between humans and machines. Lebbeus had a deep interest for cybernetics, especially for the work of Heinz von Foster. In projects like Centricity and also Underground Berlin, the concept of time and people interweave with machines. Communities and machines extend perceptions, creating networks of communication and ways of experience each other and the environment differently. In one of the quotes of his book, 154, he says, the vertical structures are axes around which turn activities requiring the making of elements, increasing human sensitivity to the continual flux of the physical. Oscilloscopes, refractors, seismometers, interferometers, and others as yet unknown instruments measuring light, moment, force, change. Tools to extend perceptibility to all scales of nature are built spontaneously, playfully, experimentally, continuously modified in home laboratories. In laboratories there are homes.
Another one of the questions or queries would be about fictional buildings, and is related to the architect's relationship to his or her own work. As a profession, so related to attend collective and individual queries, what are the possible relations between the architect and his work, and his primary motivation to pursue his own interests? On what is literature?
So when Sartre wrote on what is literature, he was writing about that for him, after the Second World War, literature was a way for you to situate yourself. There's no other way during the invasion than to be situated. There's no way to go for a McDonald's or go to the cinema. So he wrote on that book that you are abruptly situated. And that notion of literature is how we are interpreting building fictions, as the idea of situating yourself within a certain scenario.
You might know the architecture publication series called Pamphlet Architecture. In Pamphlet Architecture number 6, in 1980, Lebbeus published the Einstein tomb, or in his own words, a vessel journeying outward on a beam of light emitted from Earth. The project says as much about Einstein as it frames the motivation of the architect. Why create such a project? Who would it be for? Who is the audience? The drawings display basic volumetry, a cross in an outward mandala trajectory. The silence of the construct mirrors the power of the proposal. Its power opens many questions, like in fiction, where ambiguity cuts through the obvious. And another quote from Lebbeus: the tomb is a vessel journeying outward on a beam of light emitted from Earth, following an immense and subtle arc through the stars.
And a third question, in order to compress what is a lunchtime event and not a biblical event, is the question of nature and technology. To what extent these two are interweaving, to what extent we can start looking at some strategic or some strategic moments in his own work, or as he said, some principles in his own work, to start investigating a few ideas that might be branching to some of the speakers' own interest. So one of the questions is the nature of technology, as I just said. Terms like ecology, global warming, smart, or preservation become so important today, they need to be buried altogether. They might have lost any sort of potential revolutionary or radical meaning that these words had 200 or even 30 years ago. In projects like Centricity and Underground Burning, Lebbeus proposed or scripted a city beneath a city, in the case of Underground Burning, showing existing urban subway lines, but the narrative here is in fact deeply environmental. What is happening in these cities is much more than political unification. From the subtle vibrating planetary mass of the Earth come seismic forces, the towers and bridges in equally subtle vibrations. The inhabitants of the city feel them, perhaps in a way we will call subliminal, because the structures they build are of metal sheets, steel and aluminium, he wrote, and bronze and copper. These living and working places vibrate and resonate in a great civic space of the light. Like musical instruments, they vibrate and shift in diverse frequencies in resonance within the earth and also with one another. He wrote about underground burning. So with these three questions, we hope to start to introduce the guests today, which are, as mentioned, three educators, architects from within the school with an amazing career inside and outside academia. Theo Spyropoulos, as many of you know, is an architect and educator based in London. He's co-founder and director of Minima Forms, an experimental architecture and design practice. His work has received international attention, which has included nominations for the Chernikov Prize. If you don't know this prize, you should definitely check. In architecture, named one of the top 10 international public art installations by the Telegraph for his work, Memory Cloud, that we hope or wish that he can present it today. And most recently, Minima Forms was awarded Best Idea Creative Work in the 5th Chinese International Beijing Biennale. We also have from Diploma 2, Didier Faustino. Didier lives and works between Paris and Lisbon, and I think he's probably missing here in London now for the last 3-4 years. His work reciprocally sums up an art from architecture and architecture from art. In distinct using genres in a way that summarize an ethical and political attitude about conditions for constructing a place in the social cultural fabric of the city. Spaces, buildings, and objects show themselves to be platforms for the intersection of the individual body and the collective body in their own use. And the third speaker of today is Liam Young, Unit Master of Diploma 6. Liam Young is an architect who operates in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures. His project developed fictional speculations as critical instruments to survey the consequence of emerging environment and technological futures. He's founder of the think tank Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, a group who explores the possibility of fantastic, speculative, and imaginary urbanism, and co-runs the Unknown Fields Division, which many of you know here from within the school, a nomadic studio that travels on expeditions to the ends of the earth to investigate in forgotten landscapes, alien terrains, and industrial ecologies. So, thanks very much. We would like to pass on for our first speaker, Theo. Thank you. For people standing, there are a few seats here in front. There are 3 seats, and there is no seats here. But there are chairs you can sit.
Okay. Thanks to Nannette and to Ricardo for giving me the chance to speak today. I've been given the opportunity or the misfortune, if you like to call it, to somehow bring together Lebbeus Woods, cybernetics, and my own sort of interests, which I think is a really interesting and challenging task, and in a strange way set me off in some strange self-reflection mode. Lebbeus Woods taught for many years at the Cooper Union and the Pratt School of Architecture, which I studied across the river at a school called the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And I've always had a great deal of respect in terms of a much larger project and a conversation which I hope I can share with you in terms of an affinity between some of the experiments that were going on at that time at Cooper Union, and in particular some of the experiments that were going on here. Remembering Lebbeus Woods, I think it's also important that we lost also a couple of other, let's say, giants among experimentation in architecture, and one of them is Hans Hollein, who mentioned that all is architecture. Another one was Raymond Abraham, who also had a very strong, let's call it, attitude and affinity towards experimentation and actually the whole act of drawing and constructing. In particular to Lebbeus Woods, his conversations about cybernetics was actually a strangely personal journey as well. So his interest or his conversation through cybernetics happened through a man named Hans von Forster, who used to run something called the Biological Computation Lab in Illinois at the IIT. And part of that, there unfolds a conversation that I'd like to share about his kind of influences of people like Gordon Pask and the Archigram group, and a certain kind of attitude that he saw that was very important to him, which was the act of construction, which is a very cybernetic or radical constructivist kind of idea, which is our understanding of the world is personal, and it's a construction. And that construction goes through different attitudes of feedback and circularity, but in a way, we all create and invent our own understanding of things. And in particular, I tried to see what kind of conversation he had here. And in '84, on an invitation from Zaha Hadid and an exhibition and a publication that was put on by the AA was a show called Origins. And in that show were interesting drawings from the late 70s to mid 80s, which were really his kind of teasing out of this kind of transition, I think, that Brett was talking about, from being someone who was illustrating ideas for others to being one who started to construct his own consequences through the act of drawing. And so early renditions of these start to construct these ideas of cities and nature. More common in terms of his understanding are his relationships to war. And one of the things that maybe is important for him to understand about Lebbeus Woods is that his father was a military man. He grew up in the time of the Second World War. He moved around quite a lot in the States and was very much part of this kind of knowledge economy that was revolving around machines. And in a strange way, that plays a very important part, I guess, in the way that I understand certain aspects of thinking about not only biologies, but machines, but ideas of organization, and trying to explore more conversational practice. The challenges that I've had to explore certain things, I think, also resonate with some of the things that he would speak about. He saw himself, strangely, as a solitary figure, but mostly because he said he was a pessimist. Not necessarily a pessimist, probably completely the other, but there is a kind of idea and a certain kind of attitude towards reality that he shared. And sort of opening yourself up to that, I think, affords a very different kind of perspective about the nature of how one goes about their own practice. And he will speak, have a short video that he'll speak a little bit about. But his relationship with Sarajevo was not because he had an interest in war, it's that war somehow found him. Within the archive of the AA, we have certain drawings which were called figures, which he titled, which were drawings that I had never seen before, but they were really drawings that had almost this cyborgian kind of wrestling of kind of man-machine. And cybernetics, in the most fundamental sense, is really about communication between man and machine, animal and machine. those drawings at the AA also had these kind of very postmodern tendencies where you see these kind of primitives of circles and pyramids and triangles, ideas of sort of refactoring, I think, some of the things that his colleagues were looking at. And the act of drawing became a very important and discursive way of rendering kind of his constructions and at the same time working through, I think, a series of these kind of cities and foundations that he was looking at. When I was a student at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, I guess in my own world, I was trying to work through things. I never, I think, drew very well. I had an affinity to painting. I was very much influenced by people that were teaching at Cooper Union, like John Haydock. Not literally trying to copy them, but really trying to forge a kind of relationship with the way that one starts to deal with surface, how one starts to explore painting and drawing. The ideas of models have always been very important to me, and the kind of attitude towards developing, sketching to models is something that was really important for a host of different reasons, but it was a certain way of kind of working through some of these challenges. And in a host of kind of different experiments with my interests in Rauschenberg and other people, trying to find a way that I could sort of work through my own interests. And in a certain time, kind of fast forward maybe 15 years, 20 years now, come to terms of what those machines and the mediums that we use to explore actually mean. So when I mentioned that he was very much influenced by his military life, it was a kind of idea of sort of constructions that were in a certain sense ephemeral. He believed in a certain way that architecture had fundamentally a very interesting role to construct space, but without meaning. And like cybernetic principles, everyone brings their meaning towards these things. When he looked at the machines, he, in a certain way, was not looking at a literal machine. He was not looking at the kind of superficial organization of things like was titled deconstruction. He basically says that that was a marketing ploy. But really he was trying to look at a deep meaning when he was looking at some of the things like deconstructivist literary theory, that there was a certain attitude towards that construction that was really important. With my students, we're always trying to explore different things in the DRL, and part of that is some way of developing a very active dialogue between machines, between the challenges of humanity, and developing a certain kind of social infrastructure that enables a certain attitudes for space making. When you see his response, you'll see that he basically was also responding to people like Mies, which was the environment in which he was sort of operating within. This is Hans Wein-Forrester, who was basically trying to tease out these relationships between biology and computation. And there's a very strong root of a conversation that was born out of the late 40s, early 50s, and were manifested in different ideas of trying to construct what an architecture machine could be, challenging, let's say, prescriptive ideas of what a computer was, and sort of unfolding a kind of conversation, I think, which enabled a very different and rich kind of idea of how to bring forth, in a poesis kind of way, a certain kind of project or a maverick machine. Within the DRL, within some of the things that I do with my brother, we're always trying to explore certain kind of tendencies about how computation and, in particular, animalistic kind of tendencies within the natural world are sort of operating, and in a way is trying to develop a deeper understanding of resolution and the interaction between things. The Macy's conference, I think, is a very important moment because there was a time when people actually understood that they didn't know what they were doing. And to open up kind of thought experiments and speculative ways of bringing together a much more interdisciplinary kind of conversation. So you had people like Margaret Mead, or you had Heinz von Forrester, you had a whole series of thinkers in the world that were coming together to really discuss and try to forge together a very particular interest, which was something about the project that was actually being constructed in the present. On the right is an illustration that's also in the AA archive of Lebbeus Woods, which starts to sort of tease out this kind of hybrid, mechanical, surrealistic phase in his own work. On the left is a project by Nam June Paik. who was working with a celloist and a performance artist to develop a kind of attitude towards the robot. Performance, robotics, human kind of interfaces and interactions are very much at the heart of certain things. This is another illustration by Lebbeus Woods done in the mid-80s, where he's trying in a strange way to somehow negotiate between these geometric primitives, this kind of almost neuromancer-like kind of attitude towards the body. In my own kind of earlier work, when I was working with a colleague, Vasilis Trompakos, and David Green, who's sitting in the back, gave us an opportunity when we were literally kids to rethink the whole idea of the city and to rethink the idea of body and technology. We developed a project called the Face Breeder, where we tried to take apart the constructions of the physical machine and reconstitute it as a kind of interface to allow people to communicate through it. It was our simple attempt, I guess, to talk about London as a city that is really a cultural hybrid machine, and through portraiture, create a way that people can contribute themselves to this machine and generate something else. A lot of the work that I've done, particularly with my brother and my colleagues, has very much revolved around these kinds of questions of technology, but without foregrounding technology in any sense. And they sort of tease out certain kinds of conversations about the nature of interaction and the construction of knowledge and understanding. That's not necessarily tied to people, but between people and other people, people and machines with other machines. And Gordon Pask is a very important figure within that world, and strangely enough is how Lebbeus Woods saw his connection to a conversation which influenced him very much, which was tied to this place and the work of Archigram and the influences of people like Cedric Price through the world of Gordon Pask and Hans Wein-Forster at the IIT. This world is something that kind of evolves with a whole series of other kind of experiments within cybernetic discourse. So projects like the Sensor that was developed down the street at UCL by Edward Anatovich, we're all building up on a certain legacy of how information and communication really resonated through things. So someone like Claude Shannon, who had a deep interest in maze solving problems within the mechanical world, but also with juggling, is also the father of information theory that very much highlights a lot of the work and the things that we sort of relate with in everyday practice. In our own work with projects like the petting zoo that was at the Barbican, we've tried to explore certain ideas of a kind of analog intelligence, building on some of those things that Claude Shannon was doing, but also trying to explore that through gesture and emotive response. And these things are very important to me because I think primarily a lot of the work that we're trying to do in a similar fashion in terms of how Lebbeus Woods would speak about how we construct worlds is through our experience, and that's why he saw things in a very personal way in terms of his approach. Not very interested in stylistic sort of affinities towards things, but I think in terms of a statement of purpose, he saw his work, and at times I see my work, as a way of actually constructing a conversation between people. And I think that's very important, and that doesn't tie itself towards mediums and ways of bringing these things forth. Some other of these drawings that Lebbeus had done that was on show here were really constructing this notion of the city. And what's interesting about the city was basically a stage set for certain kinds of ideas of conversation. Once again, there's this kind of humanoid kind of capacity to look at things, which I think is interesting. But for the work that he's very famous for from the 90s onwards, you'll see that the human in all forms is completely, let's say, not present. And part of that, I think, is a realization in his own work that the human wasn't necessary, that architecture could exist beyond, let's say, the perceptual devices of any one person, and that's why he had a certain attitude towards the destruction and the necessity to actually reconsider those things as scabs and other aspects in which the city could sort of respond to. That notion of constructing through a personal and visual perspective is something that we at Minima Forms really try to find a way to sort of work through more of a sensorial attitude. And these attitudes that you can see in terms of these strange scenarios that are sort of captured within the drawings are things that we try in some way to sort of enable within the instruments that we create for people. A photo capture device that we developed to allow people in the face breeder to be sort of captured within the machine. The idea of constructing theater basically through human interaction by using masks as a device to sort of enable a much more complex series of relationships. These are all part of kind of ideas that I've been influenced, and my brother, through work of Cedric Price, Gordon Pask, Archigram, all of the radical guys from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. When it comes to the issue of war, Lebbeus Woods had a very particular kind of response to those things, and he developed a whole series of projects that were really around Sarajevo in particular, and it was a release of a pamphlet architecture in the 90s when I was a student on war and architecture, which was really important to me, mostly because of his statements of purpose. He basically said that architects are constructors of the world. They are sort of responding to not only, let's say, building as practice, but there's a deep intellectual and philosophical sort of project and problem within the kind of social and the cultural interplay. And he had a certain attitude towards politics, which had nothing to do with Republicans and Democrats, but the idea of art, of bringing forth the possible, which politics somehow resonates with. He saw his work as art of bringing forth the impossible. And with war in particular, I've had a strange tangential relationship with my work with Krzysztof Wodicko, where we've been working with war veterans and constructing a certain kind of cultural prosthetic, which is meant as a way to address certain aspects of trauma. And in a way, there are drawings and there are models, but most importantly is a kind of relationship that one sort of develops and a sensitivity to a problem when one is actually faced with actually speaking with people in a way, using design, creative processes to somehow enable a conversation that language sometimes doesn't necessarily fully fulfill. I'd like to play a short little video of Lebbeus Woods speaking about his relationship to cybernetics, if that's okay. Because you don't have to take my word for it. I think his words resonate more.
Very technical papers. Gradually, I absorbed, I never had him as a teacher, but I absorbed things through working with him.
Speaking about Heinz.
That, again, I didn't realize so many years later. I didn't realize how much they impacted my view of the world, my way of thinking about things, my idea of knowledge, because Heinz is very much an epistemologist. He's very much interested in what is knowledge. How do we know what we know? And why do we think we know it? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to phrase it. So it was only many years later that I began to realize how much this had impacted my thinking as an architect. And Heinz, what he thinks of my work has always been a matter of interest and frustration to me, because he very much believes that this isn't Heinz von Förster view of the world. It's mine. And it's not the same as his. And it's very important to him that each individual develop their own interpretation of ideas, their own way of seeing things. So I've never quite understood what he really thought of my work, except that he considered it very inventive. However, but I knew there were certainly things he didn't agree with, or that I had interpreted differently than maybe he had intended. But he respects my right to interpret these ideas in the way that I do. But I think he was a decisive influence, but it only became clear to me over time, over many years. The question of whether there's a recursion between memory and desire, between the present, what we want to do, and yet what we bring from the past with us, Almost certainly there is. In cybernetics, of course, there is the belief that we are in a closed system neurologically with our environment, so we don't really have access to so-called objective knowledge. We only have access to the knowledge that we have within this closed system. Now, whether you take that rigid a view or not, either way around, there is this interactive feedback quality where you're constantly recycling your own material. I mean, maybe this is most clear in literature. Writers who draw on the material of their experience and keep reworking that experience over and over again. And each time they write a novel, of course, it changes their memory of the experience. This is one of the key things, is that when we do have this recursion, it doesn't just, it's not the same old stuff going round and round and round. We keep transforming it. We make it into something new every time we reinterpret it. And I think that's an important aspect of our reuse of our own experience, because that's all we have at the end. We don't really have universal truth. We don't have knowledge of the absolute. We only have what we've experienced, and that's got to be the basis of our work. And by the way, our communication with each other, our social existence, has to be based just on our individual experiences and how we're able to exchange those.
I think with that, I'll probably bring it to a close. Thanks.
So thank you, Ricardo, Nannette, for this invitation. The exercise for me, it's not an easy, let's say, exercise in the point of view of my work is not related directly to Lebbeus Woods work, but strangely, when you invite me to speak about of my work related to the topic of fiction, I start to think why I should speak or how I should speak, how I can speak about. Strangely, Lebbeus Woods for me is, I have a very strong relationship, not on my work. I don't feel it's a strong relationship, but more a strong relationship about what is permitted for my generation, for this period on architecture make possible. For me, there is two figures who are now disappeared, is Lebbeus Woods and the other one is Gigi Ballard. Strangely, two figures who grow up during the Second World War with this big change on the history of humanity, where, let's say, war became an industrialization, a kind of moment where war became global. I will start about my own work, to present my own work, and probably to quote Lebbeus Woods with something who, for me, became really important in the architecture, is also to reveal our own parkour or trajectory of fragilities. So the quote is very simple, is I declare war on all icons and finalities, on all histories that will chain me with my own falseness, my own pitiful fears. Probably I didn't know about this quote when I start architecture, but I make it mine after. And probably also that's why my work is related in a bit to art, is because some people, these guys before me, claim the fragility of the practice. So my work is related to most of reference are fictionals, come from fictions. Two of my favorite ones are Tron and Dawn of the Dead Zombie, for the most people knows about. It's about trajectories, it's about bodies, it's about space and occupation of territory. My practice started with a few years ago with a company, a small firm called Miss Architecture, who was, let's say, claiming an unexpected and unusual desirable event. I'm based in Paris. I work with a series of persons since all these years, and I will show you a series of projects. I think most of the time I come from France, and usually, as Peter Cook used to say, French are boring with philosophy. So I will not make the philosopher, I will just show you some of my small things, and you will make the connections. One of my recent work, just finished, completed last work, is on the park of André Bloch, a strange figure, also an interesting French figure of architecture, who was the former director of the review Architecture d'Aujourd'hui. He was not an architect but an engineer, but he claims this freedom to build architecture. In his park, near Paris, his house is in this park, and he decided to build this kind of strange sculptures. This is what he called habitacle sculpture habitacle. I was invited by the today owner to do something on here, on this park, and how can we do something after this historical and so important things. I propose to declare the war to André Bloch. As Lebbeus said, architecture and war are not incompatible. Architecture is war, war is architecture. So I just try, in a way, to be irrelevant, to be not polite with André, and I just use the forget space of the park to put this explosion, this distracted, this missing object for event, for bodies, a place to act, to react, to be political, to be engaged, and to express ourselves. Main thing, and then I will stop for the quotes, just concluding with one quote of Woods, but this one is really important for me. The translation is construction of islands is the inversion of habitat. There is no more time to put objects in an environment, in architecture, let's say, but to put environment in the construction. That's what we try at our office, from the brutal fragility of the contemporary world to the brutal reality, and to play in between. Playing in between with many times nothing, with only what we find. This is basically my first project in architecture in professional life. It was my first commission for these kids in Portugal, a destructed, a kind of small high-rise for 5 years old, 7 years old kids. About fragility, producing vortex with the most ambiguous material, with super high technology, using in satellites, but also using by homeless people to be just protected from the thing and to help them to survive about conditions. Producing architecture, environment, putting environment inside the buildings to generate new situations, possibles. Usually, I like to see architecture in the space between the spectator and the actor. What interests me is the in-between, is the trajectory, is blurring the line, is also studying the point or the context for bodies to move inside this situation. as Wood was saying, my fairness is also what I used to claim. And the depth in architecture, and it's probably what interests me the most when I study Lebbeus Woods drawings, is these possibilities, or this infinity of possibilities of interpretation. That's the really, for me, the point who gives me this legacy on my work. This is not a quote, this is my first manifesto, my first engaged, let's say, position as a young practitioner. About the things, most of the project I'm showing to you, this one is called La soutenable légèreté de l'être. It's from Kundera book, and some other things like this body in transit architecture of shelter to protect migrants traveling from one point to the other one are linked to some, let's say, in-between or conflictual situation. I claim, I try to claim, I am an architect of the in-between. I am the architect of limit point. That's the things I try to do, exploring situation, exploring situations who most of the time can be real or unreal. Ricardo and Nannette, you asked me to talk about fiction. In fact, most of the works I'm showing you are based on fictional situations. This one is an interpretation of The Jump on the Void by Yves Klein. And you know, this is a fictional picture. It never happens. Actually, this picture is not real. It's not. And I try to do it. More other things, like 1 square meter house, objects for today or tomorrow, I don't know, but claiming and saying, forget individual body, go back to a kind of exchange between bodies. And architecture is about the exchange, is about finding the way to connect each one to the other ones. I produce a lot of devices, a lot of things. I mean, architecture, and it's also probably the thing interests me and was the big contribution by Lebbeus, is the fact architecture is everywhere. One object to the other one, the scale is not the big problem. You can go from a small prosthesis to a big proposal, a big analysis. In this case, it's the manipulation of the most known object to contain the trajectories, the barriers for the police, to transform it in a kind of absurd and decorative object and to change the use of it. In this case, for a performance, a jail, or a garden, a fake garden. Other things is about producing from the garbage of our society. Is something sometimes difficult to say, but architecture for me is also coming from the misunderstanding. And probably what I learn, what I understand from Lebbeus' work and productions was this fact we can do architecture with everything. And in this case was to produce a kind of one-to-one body protection, a home architecture made with the carpet of our interiors. But also something for me is important is also to see the world we live and the possibility of a catastrophic situation. And this case is another thing we are working on, is a tower somewhere in the world and some elements of interiors. I will conclude with a small film. It doesn't work.
Just put the cursor. Just press on the image. Yeah?
No. Shit. I think the link is
Sorry, I have to be different and use my laptop. Okay. Ricardo initially suggested that I talk a little bit about Lebbeus and this idea of exploring the relationship between nature and technology. I was struck by Jeff Manno. I don't know if you guys know, hopefully you know, Building Blog. He wrote an extraordinary obituary for Lebbeus where he talked about the idea of Lebbeus in all senses of the word destabilizing the ground. This idea of that architecture in the broadest sense augments the earth. So in a way I wanted to talk about that kind of augmented earth in my 15 minutes and take us a tour along the pipelines of technology to sort of follow the fiber of our networked landscape along an internet infrastructure or a technological infrastructure, the scale of the planet, and explore its consequences and implications. So I've been writing this storytelling piece called Baby Baby Justin Bieber in the Shadows of Technology. And I thought I would take a little piece of that today to try and tease out this relationship that architects, architecture, and culture might have with technology and landscape. Because in a way, this is where we should start, right? So this little bastard, oh, sound's coming out of here. This little bastard here is Justin Bieber. And somehow, in some way, he says everything we need to know about technology and nature. Because you can't just think of him as some ordinary, everyday kid, right? He's not just this kind of 18-year-old sensation. He's a kind of a media cyborg, right? Like, to understand him, and increasingly people like us, you've got to think not just about us, our bodies, our flesh cells, but about the media we create and the media that's created around us and by us. The kind of the atmospheres, auras, or environments of technology beyond the physical spectrum. Justin fucking Bieber. So we begin our tour here. Warmed by the glow of a luminous screen, we stare out at our place in the world. So at the resolution of Google Earth, a pixel is just a bit bigger than the width of our body, 0.41 meters. At this resolution, we are just a kind of a discoloration, thoroughly embedded in the grain of technology and indistinguishable from the city and landscape that surrounds us. We developed this little animation of a near-future skyline. This is based on a series of tower blocks that we saw emerging in Korea that were branded and built by Samsung, the technology company. Working with Tim Moore, a science fiction author, we described this very intimate relationship that we start to have with technology. He's written a short story to accompany this panorama. I'll quote a little bit from it. Jury drops the Samsung Galaxy SX phone onto the kitchen table, hears it chime softly as it makes contact with that paper thing Samsung QI Smart Power charging mat. He says, "Honey, what's the cardboard tube in the hallway?" Sang's voice comes back from the lounge, muffled by the low hum of her Samsung air conditioner. "That's a TV, come and see." "What?" she says. "It's the packaging the new TV came in. I've just hung it. Come here and see." Dewey pushes open the door to an explosion of pixels the width of the room, an ultra-high-def orgy of thrown paint and 4K rainbow ejaculate soiling pristine white space. "Nice, huh?" he says. "Yeah, it's great, but why does it say LG on it?" Because it's made by LG. "Move it now," she says. Sang looks confused, almost hurt. "You mean the TV?" "The packaging first. Get it out of the hallway. Bring it in here now. Get it out of here before anyone sees it." "Baby," he says. "Don't baby me. You're trying to get us thrown out. Our lease is up for review in 3 months. And you bought an LG TV into a Samsung housing block. What the hell would the neighbors say?" So we're starting to develop these extraordinary and intimate cultural relationships with technology. And the physical city as we know it around us is starting to dissolve. The traditional infrastructure of pipes, roads, buildings, and public squares are starting to give way to ephemeral global supply chains, logistics infrastructure, digital networks, biotechnologies, and cloud computing connections. The physical city as we know it is starting to erode, and we need to understand it in multiple ways, just like Justin fucking Bieber. We start to locate ourselves in cities, not through sight lines or orientation points, but glowing rectangles and dancing fingers. But it's not kind of dissolving into the cloud. The internet is not a cloud of ephemeral webs or connections as we think about it here in this. It both exists nowhere, but also everywhere. It's a physical city that is in fact atomized and stretched across the planet. Briefly, we're going to follow these fiber tendrils across the planet, exploring the communities and infrastructures they generate, from the ocean floor to the shore, where the internet is thought of as both a profoundly ephemeral thing. 60 grams is the weight of electrons, if you measure the internet in those terms, or 182,500 tons if you measure it by the weight of servers that power it. It's an internet with shadows and black spots, managed by companies and nation states. And who owns this pipe is critical, where a Georgian woman can cut off internet to the whole of Armenia when she's scavenging for copper and cuts the cable. Where 3 men are arrested off the coast of Alexandria, accused of trying to cut the internet to Egypt by sabotaging an undersea cable. And these new forms of infrastructure along this augmented earth of Lebbeus suggests new forms of community. It is a time when the city is itself in question. We're much closer to our virtual community than we are to our neighbors. Where the Egyptian revolution, for example, was a revolution formed through a network. Spem Hammersley, the former editor of Wired, says Al-Qaeda is just a mailing list with a weapons budget. The US military deployed aerial systems to force the internet on dictators who have closed down or censored the network. And it's kind of an instant internet city as a form of weaponized connectivity. And this same tech is not just in the hands of the military. In the skies we see flocks of bird dancing, but with them we might begin to see a strange new set of internet creatures drifting on the thermals. So here we see the Electronic Countermeasures project that we developed, which is a flickering flock of pirate internet drones that drift across the skyline, broadcasting their own place-specific Wi-Fi network. So on this augmented Earth, we might start to imagine the drone jockeys conducting this flock of interactive drones that form their own place-specific local Wi-Fi community and pirate file-sharing network. As a kind of an aerial Napster, they perform this balletic aerial choreography as their soft glow reflects in the glass of the city. We start to imagine that new geographically specific data cultures may emerge in this landscape. And like particular areas or neighborhoods in cities that are defined by their own qualities and atmospheres, we imagine data suburbs, where you might go to this particular part of London, not because that's where the best live music is, but because that's where the hottest music downloads are. Or above the suburban picket fences drift porn caches, or revolutionary discussion boards create new public forums in the spaces of the city, where this new type of infrastructure, this new type of architecture drifts into formation and then disperses only to reform everywhere, part technological creature, part architecture living amongst the rooftops. We imagine drones becoming kind of cultural creatures where technology is no longer just a tool, but something intimate and cultural. And here above the audience of a recent performance we did at the Barbican, drifts one of our tribal drones, fresh from a music festival. Or the glam rock drone, dancing in tune. Or the mirror ball, caught in the spotlight. A menagerie of drones drifting through the world where technology becomes enculturated in a machine, a strange kind of pet. This was a collaboration with John Cale of the Velvet Underground, and it's about to be a film released by the Creators Project that this is a rough cut of. I'm not really allowed to show, but let's move on. So from the drones, we trip the light fantastic and follow the fiber optic cables out of the sea, through the city, where we arrive at the data center infrastructure. It is the landscape of everything. All of our messages, photos, inane chatter, hopes, dreams, desires, and darkest fears is here. When our collective history is digital, this is our generation's cultural repository. These are the halls of the Facebook data center in Prineville, Oregon, that we visited last year. And here we stand on the roof of the data center and look out across this new kind of periphery. And here in this anonymous shed behind the Facebook data center is where they keep the photos. All the photos. Every photo that was ever taken, every photograph that ever will be taken is here behind the corrugated walls, not in the cathedral, not the great library, the Facebook shed. And then beyond the horizon, this nameless black building just down the road is Apple's top secret data center. There is no logo here, no flashing Apple, just a kind of a disappearance through banality. And just up the road, we get as far as the gate of Google on our trip. And this is as close as we get before a white SUV with a colorful Google logo comes to tell us we have to leave. This is the public face of Google. This is the public face of this new kind of architecture. But here we look through the O's behind the playful idents. And we see racks and racks of search histories, Gmails, books, and the history of everything, where playgroup colors and candy cane services create this kind of air of frivolity, accessibility, and play. But in reality, this is probably the most secure site on the planet. These photographs are not ours, but are just a peek we get in through a locked door of 16 photographs that exist of it online, which are taken by a Google-sanctioned photographer. So this landscape, this architecture, this augmented terrain is simultaneously both the site of the most surveillance on the planet, but at the same time the least. And all the world's data center infrastructure, all of these buildings sit here in Prineville, Oregon, at the confluence of cheap hydro energy and tax incentives. These nowhere streets, this new periphery contains everything about who we are. Our cultural legacy, our collective history now sits kind of behind the thriftway, drenched in the stench of diner pancakes and simulation maple syrup. And for this is, in a way, how we see our new world. We see the world through the eyes of these machines, the algorithmic gaze of the digital eye. And this is how these systems read the architecture of the city, identifying markers, reducing detail and complexity, A space organized for machines. This is the Amazon fulfillment center. Based on sorting algorithms, the space is organized not through the logic of something like the Dewey Decimal System that you might kind of know through a library, but based on proximity and sales frequency. So without the machine that Amazon navigate this space with, the space is entirely illegible to the people that occupy it. I like to start to think about a kind of fiducial architectures like QR codes and barcodes, things that are only designed to be read by the machine. What does that mean for an architecture? An architecture that's fiducial, that's designed to be experienced not by our eyes, but the machines, where calibration markers must be used to read a wall. We've been taking these markers out into the city, creating a form of calibration graffiti, imagining where these cultures might emerge, where we might start to hack the algorithms of drone vision, for instance, or the algorithms of the traffic cameras to spoof or create mischief and misdirection. Because these facial algorithms scan us, they reduce identity to proportions, markers, and shades of black or white. We start to imagine that's a bit of new aesthetic for you, where new fashion cultures emerge to counter recognition algorithms. This is a project by Adam Harvey. Behind the pixel glitch is actually a series of makeup patterns designed to confuse the facial recognition algorithms. We start to imagine new fashion seasons not based on the time of the year, but based on Moore's law or the latest Apple launch. And Google used the same algorithms to blur out our faces in Street View. Could you imagine an architecture designed for these systems where perhaps a building that has the same proportions of a face starts to be identified as a strange kind of stealth object within the visions of Google? So we imagine a kind of this fiducial architecture in this online WebGL project that we developed, where we're exploring what the city might be through the eyes of a lone drone drifting through the landscape. So through this WebGL app, you can pilot a drone and experience the city reduced to geometry, a city of calibration markers, surfaces, points, where the life of the city dissolves into the computational algorithms of machine vision. So cities and landscapes at the scale of the planet become kind of compressed to the control room. This is this idea of the SCADA city. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. These are the brains that exist behind our urban spaces that run our tube network, our buses, where the complexity of urban culture, life and wonder become reduced to management protocols and these kind of low-res systems diagrams. And they start to shape and make technology. There's an Attenborough commentary on this that I won't try and play through my laptop here. But this describes this traffic system of the city actually starts to mediate nature, where this bird, this crow, has evolved to become dependent on a species of nut that its beak hasn't evolved to crack. So it perches above the traffic pedestrian stoppings, waits for the light to turn red, and then walks out with everyone else to pick up the nut in safety. Or here in San Francisco, where a group of raccoons have memorized the number 18 bus timetable because every Friday night the driver brings some tins of dog food. So the mechanisms and technology of the city start to regulate nature, culture, and all aspects of our lives to the point where, just like Bieber, it's difficult to start to distinguish them. And moths flock to the streetlight stars and artificial moons of the city. And these buzzards in Sao Paulo laze around in the heat generated by air conditioning exhaust vents. And to finish this project called Silent Spring, which really needs sound, in this project I released 80 canaries into a sealed gallery space. And slowly I increased the levels of CO2 in the gallery in line with predicted increases in global climate change, imagining what would happen to the atmosphere if our culture continues without change. It is kind of an interior model of an accelerated climate change. And against the rise in CO2, I narrate the predicted developments in technology, the wonders of possible progress. And across the course of the performance, what we hear is the birdsong starting to change. In 50 years, the birds are no longer singing. If we listen, we're strolling towards a silent spring, a kind of a augmented earth, the landscapes of technology and the technologies of landscape. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Liam, Theo, and Didier for the fantastic lectures. Now we have a half an hour ending for the event, which is going to be a round table with Q&A, and hopefully very soon opening questions and answers actually for you as well. So I'd like to invite all the guests. Maybe we can lift the canvas, the projecting canvas, and I'll invite the guests please to come over to the front. So before there's a mass exodus,
I think you missed that boat.
in search for triangle sandwiches upstairs or the local pret-a-manger, I'd like to first thank the guests again for taking the challenge to discuss their work via Lebbeus Works. Of course, it's always a great challenge that you don't want to pigeonhole your own work, and also as hosts, you don't want to force connections which are potentially not there. But there is something that really strikes me on the presentation of all three, and that might be a commonality as also a point of divergence, is that it looks like all three of you tackle or have projects which are larger in terms of scale and interest than the work produced itself, and the work in terms of scale varies. So I think many of you use installations or use certain principles of robotics or tests and experimentations to discuss those larger subjects, sometimes the poetic of the relationship between the body and human, or the notion of communication and information between man-machine or animals, machines, and humans, and also the whole idea of the digital world, which transforming one of the cliches of today, however, as shown on the presentation, is just far from mapped and recognized as we think so. So the first questions, probably for all three, if you can discuss a little bit more about this relationship between the medium that you work and also the thematic. Because on Lebbeus it was interesting that he had a series of drawings and a few installations, but the thematics that he discussed were large in epistemological sense and also in a conceptual sense. So the question is the relationship between the ideas and the medium that you explored.
Pick one.
You. Let's go.
Yeah, I mean, we use in our work a number of tools, but really, I think what we're trying to do in playing with different mediums is something that I think is in common with Lebbeus's work, is that we're trying to take the discourse about architecture and the spaces that we inhabit outside of the traditional realms of architecture itself, right? And so to move beyond the traditional floor plan or section and to start to explore modes of storytelling, performance, installation, suggests the possibility for alternative audiences. Like architects spend a lot of time in rooms like this, generally with the blinds down, showing each other PowerPoint presentations. But to take the work outside of these contexts, no longer start to talk about the unbuilt competition project that we coulda, woulda, shoulda won, and start to create a film about our work, or to create a performance that people can go and watch, that the public might engage with in different ways. I think that's certainly for us at the heart of why we engage in these different kind of mediums for the projection of ideas, right? Is to, a really critical part of Lebbeus's project is to talk about the world and our role within it and the politics implicit within it. And it's such an important conversation that architects can start to have. It's so critical that we find other vehicles and mediums through which we can project it as loud as possible, as far as possible, to as many different audiences as possible.
I guess when it comes to the work that I do, in particular with Stephen and my colleagues, we're not really very concerned about mediums. I think what we're trying to do is make things more shared and collective, and to be honest, we don't really have an approach towards style, but we try to explore a certain sensibility which actually facilitates a certain form of communication. So the way that we use projects, if it's a cloud, if it's an interface, if it's a piece of machinery, if it's a building, an urbanism, is a way to actually try to construct maybe more informed ways of asking questions. I think that's really important. And I think that's something that the lecture or the interview that I showed was an interview that Lebbeus gave at SciArc. And I think that's how he sort of thought about things, is that he's working through, and his contribution for the conversation is his work. I think there are a lot of people that talk a lot, but actually projects resonate and have a very deep kind of rooted history, and some of the things that are important to us are projects that maybe have become forgotten, but actually have a very strong affinity towards some of those kind of methods and means of exploring kind of interaction between people. So I like the way that Didier expressed the idea of in-betweenness. I think that's a very important facility to have when you're actually constructing models of interaction and when you're trying to enable other people to participate. So a lot of the things that we do are not medium specific, but they're very much engaged of allowing other people to sort of make use of that with a particular interest in the general public, as a way of really kind of demystifying how all of these things are, and to just make it something that people actually understand their participation within an event or whatever the manifestation may be. I think it's your turn.
Yeah, the question of the medium is not, for me, is not really important. I mean, most of the installation of device we produce are linked to the, let's say, the timeline. It's something, if I take architecture with the aim is to build something, the timeline is so big. We need to find other situations to express, to analyze, to work on, and to develop ideas. I will say to try to understand and to try to ask questions is the way to produce questions. So the medium himself is depending the question we are working on, or the answer we want to do. But most of the time it's not answers, it's more questions we produce. I will just give an example. For example, I'm working since 2 years on a project with a big building, not a big, but it's a building, I mean, for real. And I have a clause, something I sign in the end of the contract with confidential, and I'm not supposed to show the building until it will be built. So basically, I'm working in a kind of totally strange situation where I cannot show my work since 2 years on these specific things. So at the same time, I produce some mirage, I don't know the word in English, I think it's mirage, to talk about. So probably on some stuff I show you, probably for sure the one with the bricks and the roughness and the explosion is linked to the other project. So we find ways to, it's a media, I built it, it's the thing I produce. But now it's really about this question of showing something, discussing about something. We go to find the different, who help us? I mean, what is the most efficient in terms of explaining what we want to say.
Yeah. And maybe that's, I want to do a question, actually not for the guys on the table, but for the audience, which is to what extent through the work presented, or what's the level that in your interpretation, there is not in the sense of commonality here, but it seems that there is an element of provocation. The harder the work here is to satisfy, harder the work here seems to be about doing a manifesto about words or about some sort of a retro agenda, but it seems to be a forward investigation. So actually it's a generic question to start a conversation between the audience and the panelists and guest speakers about your impression about this relationship between the dialogue of the work and the dialogue of the architect as producer. Anyone wants to start? It's a daring moment. And that it can lead into a question as well. Silence. Okay, I'll lead to another question. Maybe you guys can break and maybe do a Q&A later. It's quite interesting, the answers, because it seems to be that because there is a need for a conversation through the work, and Liam, you were saying about showing each other's PowerPoint, but somehow the work needs an audience, and the work in search of an audience or to connect to an audience, it needs to provoke that audience. And I think in everyone here, and in your case, there is definitely a sense of provocation in the work, a sense that you start dealing with questions of the web or questions of digital technology. So to what extent that provocation is also not just on part of the producer, but also part of the conversation with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying in the discussion of mediums, the relationship of engagement within all different kinds of audience is critical to the way that we make work. I mean, we use the tool of fiction and storytelling as a way to start to create that dialogue, right? Like that. You know, this is in many ways the way our culture shares ideas. Like we all fall asleep reading a novel or spend a Friday night watching some shit movie. It's the currency with which we talk to one another through stories. So we think that's a really interesting way to think about the architect as provocateur or the architect as storyteller, as a way to present quite complex ideas about spaces, the city, and architecture in a way that actually engages and elicits response, right? Also, speculation is a similar kind of tool where you put forward a suggestion about a possible future, whether that's some kind of productive dystopia, some sort of idealist vision, and you present it in such a way that generates a response or reaction. You know, it's really easy to and kind of counterproductive to sit watching a bunch of talking heads on BBC News debating, you know, the latest discoveries in biotechnology. But it's not until you put those new technologies within a context, you start to tell a story about their possible implications, and then present that back to an audience, that you actually generate an emotive response, you know, that we start to engage in a cultural way as opposed to an abstract way. So fiction is, for us, a really critical act in the mode of provocation. And I think the same kind of, you know, Lebbeus uses the drawing as a way to draw people into that world in a similar sort of way, to elicit emotional and intuitive responses from its audience.
And Theo, Liam mentioned the notion of emotion here, and the necessity, or how you actually filter the response or utilize that response as not a one-directional line between work and the user, or let's call, I think it was mentioned here, instead of user, general public by some of you. So to what extent your work in minima forms, and potentially here, even at the school with 100+ students, that you develop that idea of the conversation, or the idea of the conversation through the notions, potentially through cybernetics, between machine and human?
Yeah, I don't know, I think, let's say if I use Hans Weinforster as a strategy for the answer, I mean, he was very much a figure who was trying to construct a framework for understanding. So in many cybernetic kind of principles, they would speak like, how do I understand understanding? How do I construct constructions? These kind of radical constructivist ideas about the nature of how one situates what they're observing. And so in many ways, I think and particularly in the work and let's say the kinds of discussions that I try to enable or foster, is one that is trying to explore curiosity, understand that there is latency and unknown, and to shift, I think, from the conventions of fixed and finite comforts, attitudes towards things, and really try to open oneself to really try to understand. I think it's really important to understand the role of experimentation today, because I mentioned people like Hollein and Lebbeus Woods and Raymond Abraham, and the drawing maybe was enough. I don't think it's enough anymore today. So if one has to situate the practice of today, one has to be very much enabled to make things happen by making them, and without necessarily having to describe what their function is, but to sort of give it over to people and to see how that somehow gets enabling kind of things that potentially maybe our forms of communication today somehow miss. Like, for example, when I say that I'm interested in putting things in a public space today, let's say Trafalgar Square, where we did Memory Cloud that you mentioned. It's a space of communication historically, but it's protest, celebration. And for example, a project like Memory Cloud doesn't foreground any technology. It actually dematerializes that. And if the conversation happens, then the project continues. But if there is no conversation and silence is probably just a communication device, then that is also part of the project. So I'm not necessarily interested in constructing audiences. I'm actually trying to construct and situate things in a way that affords a certain kind of response, but without me actually trying to offer that, which I think is very important. So for me, design and architecture has this kind of critical engagement without it having to state it.
And you mentioned experimentation, change, and the critical engagement, something that Liam also mentioned. So for Didier, I think the question here, this notion of experimentation, yes, it has shifted, it has changed from, in fact, if you look at a publication up at the library, published on the early 90s called Theory Plus Experimentation, where a lot of these guys actually meet up and discuss, is there any difference between that? Is some of us, and there was Peter Cook, Koop Himmelblau, both bricks, Lebbeus, Bernard Tschumi, you can sort of pinpoint the sort of the top published architects, if you like. There seems to be a changing notion of experimentation and potentially the validity or the alienation of to what extent experimentation become a comfortable tool. And I think in your work, if I maybe construct a parallel with Lebbeus' work somehow, or let's say modes of practice, there seems to be this constant query, this constant luring along, let's say, your role or the role of the architect and the work. This in-between or disestablishment of the work and what you produce. I guess you don't wake up on Monday knowing what you're going to do for your design. I think potentially there is a certain element of surprise. So to what extent experimentation in your work or in your view as a teacher and an architect has shifted in this during your career experience or your architecture experience?
The thing is about the practice, I don't know if it's experimentation. I mean, we are looking each day in a kind of possibility of do things. The thing is about curiosity and in a way kind of situationist point of view with this drifting, where experimentation for me seems to be, if I use the word, seems to be for me kind of too clear objective kind of thing. I would say it's a kind of, but it's linked to experimentation, but I prefer the word doubt with this kind of lack of unestablished or undefinite research. So we are researching. Sometimes it can be called experimentation, but we don't know exactly. I mean, I prefer the idea of navigating in elements where we have a lot of new, and each time new situations appears, and we try, and we use it as elements of a kind of objective with like having a kind of corpus of situations more than experimentation of in my practice, let's say scientifical structure to call it experimentation. I'm a bit afraid about this word. I prefer to say this, we try one after one, we try. And then the thing is, maybe time after time we have like moments where we have the possibility to make a kind of conclusion or a new introduction to another thing. That's why I prefer the thing of drifting. We drift, we are like exploring things. Situationist point. Maybe the... No, but I think for me is because you mentioned, let's say, another period. We are in a kind of new period, and it's the context change. I think at this time, experimentation was a kind of manifesto of a generation. were saying we experiment to have the possibility of freedom to say don't bullshit us with say the main way of building things and to practice the architecture. I think today the things are blurred and we are reinventing things. The things are really porous between us. Basically, one point between us is this thing of navigating in a kind of obscure. We take medias are interesting at one moment, we use it. That's my.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, to a large extent, an architect's skills are often wasted making a building, right? Like I studied in Australia. I grew up in a very traditional context of what architecture was. Glenn Murcutt, Touch the Earth Lightly, timber detailing of residential houses. And Lebbeus's works was something that kind of I would read like a kid in a comic under the covers with as an alternative way of operating. And I think what you called experimentation, but you know what I saw possible in that work at the time was the ability to launch a speculation with such force that it has beyond any act of ultimate realization. You know, like that the speculation was an endpoint in itself. It wasn't an unbuilt project. His works are projects. You know, not judge success or failure of any kind of built work or the lack of it in the case of his career, but more judged in the context of the questions opened and the debates raised. You know, and I think that's a really fundamental role for what the architect can start to do, is that kind of experimentation that exists beyond the act of making a building, but is actually far more crucial and fundamental in the act of making city or making space, right?
Speculative force is definitely an interesting expression they use on Lebbeus. And I do remember in Brazil getting introduced with actually this book that you guys can actually see. If it's on the screen still?
Further down, bring it down toward you. Yeah.
Well, okay, almost. Which is a book which is very precious to us because a few students gave it to us 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 or 4 years ago as a present, and it's a very expensive present because it's out of catalog. But it's interesting that these books also start of imagination, which seems essential question today in a school. So with that notion of the imagination, I would like to open questions for the audience. If you have any questions for any of the speakers or the whole event. Yeah. Just one second.
I can probably. Can everybody hear me?
Just for you, they're recording it anyway, so you should use it.
Hi. With the presentations, I think it's quite a tall order actually, just to try and set your work against Lebbeus's work. So, and I found all the presentations really interesting. There's one thing for me that kind of ran as a thread throughout it's kind of the disappearance of the body, or of the human, or people. I'm not even sure how to call us, but us. I don't want to say purpose of architecture, but we're building for humans, and then throughout the presentations, I think the CEO mentioned this quote about perception. And perception is our own invention. So it starts very much from the premise of our own experience of space and architecture. And then Didier, you mentioned that you kind of diverted from fiction, but there was something that I really liked, is the work to do with fragility. And that kind of grounds, and I think a lot of Lebbeus's work is to do with this kind of fragility and perception, even when there's no figures in his work, when there's no human present in the drawings, you can still feel this kind of fragility, the kind of the falling down when you're in that distance from Einstein's tomb, and the tomb in French is tomber, is to fall, and you can feel it in the drawings, even though there's no figurative kind of. And then Liam, you kind of concluded with the disappearance altogether of the human. So I was kind of wondering how you felt about that link, and even with the drones kind of being there without any. And you mentioned that maybe we'll be meter. We go because of certain data, but how do we perceive that? How does that change our own perception? So it's kind of an open question to all three of you, this kind of disappearance of us, or what.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with if we think about the believers, right? Like that's my point about starting with Justin is really trying to problematize the body or problematize the human, to say that to sufficiently understand the subject in this context, you need to look at kind of the media space around it and generated by it. Like that. That it's fundamental to think about. You can't. Technology doesn't exist without culture, right? So that the body is separate, and the two should be inextricably linked, I suppose, and to understand the two together is really critical to any act of science to make space for them. Like we, in the extended version of that talk, I refer to places like Chernobyl, where you have this extraordinary condition where once a very physical context, but it's a context that's been scanned and meticulously reconstructed and created into a game space that people play detached online. And game space is kind of percolated back into the physical space where local fanboys from surrounding towns come back into the landscape and recreate their characters in the game. So what is that nature of what is the nature of them as people within that site? Which kind of site are they operating in? Are they operating in the media constructed site of the game, or the physical constructed site post-nuclear catastrophe? So to talk about those kind of parallel conditions, I think is really, really critical. So I don't know if it's the disappearance of the body, but more the problematizing of the body, or that it's like, rain in the city, it's just one more kind of layer on top of space that needs to be considered, right?
From my perspective anyway, the issue is a little bit different from like the 70s mind-body problem stuff. The conversation, I think that by necessity, and in particular we try to work, is to really enable much more emotive and much more engaged kind of forms of interaction. And the reason that we think that that's very important, like, let's say in my own practice with my student that's around me, technology plays a really strong part of what we do, but we never really talk about it from a literal foregrounding. This is how we did it, these are the tools that we use, this is, for us, is not just constructing these things, but actually allowing these things to perform, using installation as a way, as a litmus test to test our own preoccupations in a world that actually is for other. Example, technology for me is a very human pursuit. So if it's really about machines interacting with people, or people interacting with machines, other people, machines and machines, all of that is part of a, which I think is very much accessible. You can say is distributed, but I wouldn't say that it's shared. I think the way that we sort of veil our forms of make it even that much more important for us to make things in the world and to put them out there. I really believe that there is a kind of facility in sort of working through things that kind of opens up a whole sense. So the body is one aspect, and sort of re-engaging with what that really means is very important. Like, with Didier, the way that I actually learned about his work was from Christoph Woditsko, who I've had the pleasure of working with. Is a very important person to me in terms of trying to create a voice for people that are part of our everyday world, silenced socially, culturally. I think that's important. I think design plays a role in that. I think that's what Liam does with his films, without stating that, is sort of bringing that into a kind of discursive way that sort of enables a conversation to be had instead of generalized. Lebbeus Woods is pretty interesting in that interview, because I've tried to find what was available, and there's really not very much. The interesting for him is that when he started that Psyarch interview, he basically said that we're in this kind of strange perpetual machine where we're constantly have been done. And he talked about the necessity to keep doing that. Because he basically said, if you take a cybernetic approach to things in this world, we all construct our world, our may have worked, and maybe this is where I have a slight difference, that everything exists online. A lot of this work doesn't. And it's important to revisit it, re-articulate maybe our position today to understand what's different. So, if Hans Hollein says, all we need, everything is architecture, I just take a pill, reconstruct my city, that's a very different generation than today, and Bieber, and this kind of conversation. And to be honest with you, I'm not here to judge one person or the other, but I think it's very important to us as active participants. And that's a very important, you mentioned about perception, that's a very big cybernetic principle, and from moving from something that's a passive observer to an active participant means that you're engaged, and that's a start. But I don't think that there's any finite aspect of that. And the questions that we're sort of interested in are only part of a much bigger project. So architecture particularly, I think, makes certain demands, and I'm interested in that, and that's why sometimes it leads us away. Sometimes it could be an instrument, sometimes it could be something else. Projects, I think, set the terms of our engagement. Some of it, anyway.
I just want to say about the body, the thing I think is linked to the question of the individual body, who was the topic. And this topic slightly changed, and today I think the disappointment is the situation is not anymore the individual body, but the collective body. And this mutation oblige us to think differently. So the exploration is, it's not, I mean, the body, if I take a metaphor of history of architecture, for me the big shift is Gordon Matta Clark, who cut the house and said architecture is not anymore one. In the case of Lebbeus, this idea of instability, and he produced an architecture who is not anymore solid. So this point is a metaphor for our society and how we consider the body. The body now is not anymore multiple, it's totally, in a way, different level. So how we approach that, I can say, okay, I do a performance to engage one individual to a situation, just take a bit distance of that. I start to think about what will be the answer or the question I'm putting on the table. So and the answer are now, I put the word when you ask disappointing situation where it's like defining today. That's the.
Any further questions at the back? David, you seem quiet there, knowing everything and everyone in the room.
When I got up this morning, I decided that it's not going to do anything.
So do with the microphone.
So I went to the Bartlett because I'd heard they got big workshops there. They showed me the workshops. I think their temporary building is probably going to be better than the new one, isn't it? And so then, as a way of preparation for coming here, I thought I got to hear what these young guns take their view on Lebbeus Woods, how they see him. I went to the ICA. They've got a very modest little exhibition there celebrating the 1968 cybernetic serendipity exhibition, and it sort of manages to drain all the interest and excitement that exhibition has, and maybe that's the fate of I think so. Maybe it's the fate of Lebbeus, simulated as all. But I don't know. I just wanted to ask you something, because it's been a bit of a sort of love-in for Lebbeus, but I was glad that Theo showed the him talking, because I always thought he's a thinker and as a highly intelligent human being was more interesting than his work. You know, I mean, I think his critic might say that he was a victim of his as a draftsman, and that in the end he wasn't able to go beyond his drawings. I don't know what you think about that, whether that's fair, because there's no doubt he had tremendous influence on his imitators. I mean, I don't know whether I should say this. I mean, I think probably the Bartlett owes more to Lebbeus than to probably any other schools. His ghost still haunts the Bartlett, and the words cybernetics still haunts us, and you wonder, well, where has it got us since 68? Maybe, I mean, was interested in the three of you, that you're sort of quite different, presenting a different take on the current reality. So I've good experience as a tourist and consumer. But consumers aren't supposed to say anything, are they? So I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, David. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree that Lebbeus was a much more interesting thinker. And I think part of that is, I mean, I would to actually see his interview on Cyark's Media Archive, because I think in some way it just basically gives a bit of a window into why now the drawings, I think, I mean, they're beautiful, but they're somehow irrelevant at some point. I think they do become triggers for, I think, a very personal, and I think the way he situates what he says and what he does, I thought that was very important to kind of communicate. His conversation, though, and the Origins catalog that Boyarsky put together here, he does a very short introduction where he basically just thanked Zaha and Boy the opportunity, which I think many people didn't, as a kind of platform to speak. And he's a very important educator. Was his value most, I guess, growing up across the river, that was very apparent, because he was part of that group of Cooper Union guys like Uck and Abraham, Scofidio, that were basically working between each other in a very, very kind of intimate way, where one project was creative friction for someone else. And I think that's quite important. So in one sense, I think this event was what I felt quite close to, was basically, probably for a lot of people that don't know Lebbeus, it's an introduction, but how they choose to use him or misuse him, like some people were saying, I think is up to them, but there is in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but without nostalgia. I mean, I believe in some of the things that they were doing, but that was their time, your time. And to be honest with you, when I showed Facebreeder, I was like 23, 24 years old, and David Green had seen me and Vasily give a talk in the University of Westminster, and to be honest with you, he just basically said, would you like an opportunity to do something? We did that piece in Selfridges. And David didn't know us, he had no connection to us, but he gave us a chance and a platform and a framework, and I'm till this day indebted to him for that. Mostly because he actually just challenged us. He basically said, if you want it, he took us to a basement and basically said, here's a lot of shitty computers, 10 years old, 5 years old, and it's junk, do something with it. And I think sometimes this idea of provocation is important to understand where that's coming from. So yes, it did mean something that this was Archigram's David Green who gave us a chance to do something. And I think that accountability for a young person today is really important, because I really do think that we're sort of evolving a discourse. And if we choose experimentation or research or whatever we want to call it today, it's part of a lineage of projects that enable us to kind of keep this thing going. And to reinstate, I think, why architecture matters today, why design matters. And, you know, we don't have to always state Korb and Mies as the orthodoxy. Some of these people were actually trying to break that orthodoxy through their work. And I think some of us today are trying to understand our role within this larger milieu that, that Didier is talking about.
I think I just want to bring up one point that I think came up several times in the conversation today is, and that's how we started actually our introduction almost 2 hours ago, is how important it is to recreate and to keep going, keep doing the things that we are doing, even though they have been done in the past, just to carry on a conversation. And I just would like to almost give that question to the students today that study today, how they feel about that, because we constantly in the units argue about what research is. It's not just about reading a book and looking at Google images. It is about making it yourself, recreating it, and by doing it, making it your own version. And that's, I think, what we are talking here about, also what Lebbeus talked about in the interview. So I would like to ask the students, how do you feel about it? You know, does it make sense to you to look at something that has been done before, but to redo it? Why should I redraw it? Why should I remake it in models?
You guys shouldn't be so shy. Right? First of all, everybody speaking here are teachers here. You wouldn't be so shy if it was in the studio. So now it's recording. You can say anything that you want on record. It goes on YouTube. It'll go on YouTube and maybe Bieber will check it out.
Well, I
Google himself.
I'll tag him.
I guess thank you for everything you said during the lecture as well. I mean, I totally agree with this thing about constantly, I mean, because we read so many things and we look at so many references, I guess this idea of owning up to them and making them your own ties in with what you were saying about and what Lebbeus was saying about perception. And I guess because all of us individually perceive architecture or perceive a book that we read or perceive different things in our own way, it's always the way that we're going to express what we've read, what we've seen through our work is like our individual construction of everything we perceive in our lives from memory or from this like recreation of references. And I totally agree with the fact that anyway, all the most secure thing that I personally think that we have to look at is the past. I mean, nobody really knows what's going to come next. So the idea of speculating on what's going to come next is always based on what we know of what has passed. So I totally agree with the fact that our speculations and our creations of stories through our projects and the different narratives all stem from our perception of everything that has passed. So, yeah, I guess, I mean, it's my opinion as well.
That history should be an enabling thing, so that you could find your friends and your enemies and understand that there were other people that potentially were working on some of these ideas and where did they stop. And it's not that you literally take their project, because you're living in a time and you have to address your own project today, right? So even if you took those ideas literally and tried to situate them today, a lot of it would be nonsense, quite naive. But to be honest with you, maybe as a starting point, that's not so bad, to actually have a little bit of optimism and to actually think that some of this stuff could actually have an influence before you get too jaded by the so-called reality of things. I think it's really important to understand that even if there is no audience, that this is so important to you that you're going to do it. And to be honest with you, when you do that, and when you start to see that these figures from New York, Japan, UK, were communicating through their projects, even if they didn't know each other, that's amazingly powerful stuff. And maybe having some sensitivity to projects and less to what's on the zine today and what's on Sucker Punch, and an idea of sort of completely disregarding the 50s till now with an idea that somehow the 20s had it better. I think it's really important to situate where you are with all of this. You yourself as an architect who's going to contribute and participate. It's your obligation. That's what's really nice about it. If you want to call yourself an architect, I think you have an accountability, because saying that means that there is something that you believe in, that you think it's a spatial problem. There's something to it. We could disagree, and I think that's important that we do. And I think today's event is also about just sort of giving some people an understanding. I don't know if everybody in the audience knew who Lebbeus Woods was. And if so, if it was because your teachers basically told you he's an interesting guy, you should check him out. It's important to try to come to terms with what is the things that are basically part of your own construction. So if you're going to construct yourself, like, it's forward thinking, it's living today and then trying to understand a bit of the past to enable you, so you don't feel burdened by it, but you're somehow empowered by the fact that some of these ideas have mattered, do matter, and will matter in the future. So we're still kind of coming to terms with Buckminster Fuller. That guy was a rock star way before rock stars were born, and he's probably influenced pretty much everybody in the AA in one way or another. People trying to discredit him, or people trying to really be empowered by a lot of the conversations that he sort of put forth on the table. So some people test the time, and other people, to be honest with you, fade away. So
that wasn't to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Interrupt as much as you like.
Any other questions? A final question, perhaps? Okay, so
someone really wants to talk from that.
There's a big crowd there. Okay, so I think it's time to end this fantastic event that we put it together. I think with a two-directional, as it was already very clear, explained by the guest critics or the guest speakers, in the sense that we can remember someone that is very dear to our own universe, but also to set up a challenge to see how architects, which are David Green called young guns, are starting to establish and can react against another architect's work without necessarily pigeonholing his or the Lebbeus Woods work. So I really want to first thank all the guest speakers for accepting the invitation and asking the audience to hang in around during the lunchtime for a couple of hours without their baguette or triangle sandwich. So thanks very much for all of you. So please help me to welcome and say bye for the guest critics, the guest speakers.